Hello again, this is your professor, Jessica Conte, and this is our week 4 video lecture for Asian popular culture and globalization online. And today we're going to be going over Chun's article, Bend It Like a Man of Chosun. And this lecture is on sports, identity, and nation. So I have a lot of students who are interested in sports, and even just looking at some of the topics you choose, a lot of you are interested in, say, basketball in China and kind of the evolution of sports over time in Asia. And this is definitely a huge topic in popular culture. For this, I'm going to be going over Jung Hwan Cheon's article and kind of looking at a way and ways we think about sports and why it is so, I guess, important as popular culture. So this article is a little bit, it reads somewhat like a memoir because the writer Cheon is going over some of his own sentiments, his own feelings about watching the World Cup, being a soccer fan, and also what he's thinking about the past of Korea. So just a note here, and I'm using my cursor, Chosun is the term that is used to describe Korea during colonialism. It is what was referred to as Korea, the entire peninsula, not north and south. And so it's a word still used today. Chosun people mean Korean people, regardless of where they're living. So it means North Koreans, South Koreans, and even ethnic Koreans who have lived in China for generations and generations. A Chosun person is a Korean person. It's also used to refer to, again, the peninsula that is now known as Korea under colonialism. And this is because when the Japanese government took over, it was in a historical era, or the last dynasty was the Joseon dynasty. You'll also see that it's often spelled differently, and this is with an O with a little curly point over it. And this is often because there are different rules on how to alphabetize different Asian languages. And I'm going to send a note out to you on that concerning your encyclopedia entries if you're having any trouble determining, the spelling of certain words, names, etc. But going back to Cheon's work, he looks first at the 1936 Berlin Olympics and at the 2002 World Cup. And so the 1936 Berlin Olympics, here we had Japan compete, but they put several Korean athletes on their competition, and the athletes competed for Japan. And in particular, Cheon looks at Son Ki-chung, who was a runner who won the marathon gold for the Japanese team. What the writer, Cheon, points out is that there is a boom in media technology also in the 1930s. That meant that there was also kind of this boom in interest in sports, global sports like the Olympics, and that this sparked this very nationalist fervor among Koreans who were at the time colonized, because they were seeing one of their own compete in a global athletic event and kind of prove their physical self-worth. He also looks at the 2002 World Cup that was co-hosted by South Korea and Japan. And for those of you who follow soccer, this was a big deal for South Korea in particular. Before it was co-hosting the World Cup, the South Korean team wasn't very well known as being a great team. And this is where they actually played very well. And even though they did not win, there's a lot of it vitalized a lot of excitement in Korea for the World Cup. And Cheon points out that during this time, too, again, there's another kind of boom in the way people are watching sports and thinking about sports. So this is the way that media, sports, and kind of national sentiment all tie together when we think about popular culture. One of the big parts about the 2002 World Cup, though, is that right before the World Cup, and we talked about this in another lecture, there was an incident that's referred to as the Yangju incident, or sometimes the tank incident. And this was when a U.S. Army tank ran over two middle school aged girls who were walking home from school in their town and killed them. And that the two drivers of the tanks, who were U.S. soldiers, were never held accountable, even though it was deemed that they should not have been on the road, they were being negligent. And what really upset a lot of Koreans at this time was not exactly that they weren't punished, although some people really wanted to see a punishment, but that they couldn't even be tried in a Korean court because of U.S. military law and its agreement with South Korea. But basically the U.S. military court and U.S. government court system superseded Korea's own court system, so that there was no way that they were held accountable in Korea for the death of these two girls. There was tons of protests that erupted of this. And so during the 2002 World Cup, South Korea and the US tied. And this was a really big deal because it was so close to this incident. And as we're going to kind of read on, people really had this big sentiment that winning this sporting event would somehow prove that in at least one arena that South Koreans could basically, quote unquote, beat the US and other colonial or powerful global forces. And Cheon writes about how in the bar that day, people were crying and fighting when the US tied with South Korea. And he says this isn't just like a sports fervor, this is because of all the sentiments and the anxiety and anger that people felt towards the US government at the time. So we're looking at two different thens because 2002 was a while ago, but we can also think about contemporary sporting events. Most recently, the Winter Olympics that were held in South Korea, and how these always very often erupt in kind of a lot of national political intrigue, political commentary, social commentary on the players, on where they're from, on things they say, on how they interact with each other and other teams, and what hosting a global sporting event means for that country. And so another example I can give about the World Cup is most recently, some of you who are soccer fans might remember that ahead of the game that was, or the match that was supposed to be played between, or that was played between Mexico and Germany, a German newspaper, a very prominent one, had a headline that said that the German soccer team was going to build its own wall against the Mexican team. And immediately this faced a lot of backlash because this is a very racist thing to say. And it was a very kind of, I guess, timely thing to say in terms of the militarization of the border and how Mexicans and Mexican Americans are treated in the US and around the world. So there was a lot of complaints about this, and Mexico did not end up winning that game. Of course, there also has to do with Germany's history of racist nationalism as well. However, the South Korean team beat the German team, and there was a day of celebration in which the Mexican government came out and the embassies came together and people were celebrating. The Korean embassy in Mexico had a huge celebration, and they announced that for that day, Koreans were honorary Mexicans. And this, again, really shows the politics of race, of borders, of nation, and how this goes into global sporting events like the Olympics or the World Cup. So going back to John's article, our first question is why sports? Why is he focusing on sports? And why is this such a heated kind of realm of popular culture for people? Aside from the nationalism, he says, why, even against our better judgment, and any really big fan will kind of have the sentiment, why do sports resonate so deeply with us? So even though we know, yes, it's a game, it doesn't mean everything, it still resonates so deeply with us. And Jen points out something very interesting, and I'll just let you read this quote here. But what he's saying now, through these experiences, he means experiences of gym class, of PE, of sports, that sports is something that we all experience, whether we play them or not. Because of the way our school systems are set up early on in childhood, we're all kind of meant to be in sports. And if you can't or you don't, then you're known as somebody who doesn't do sports. And even outside the school system, you're kind of marked by, well, if you didn't get to be on a sporting team in school, if you went to a poor school that didn't have sporting equipment, or if you were playing pickup games in the street, right? We all from very early on in childhood have a lot of connections to athletics. These feelings he talks about, so he points out, so this means that early on in childhood, and let's just think about gym class, and often when I teach this class, about half the class say, no, I'm not interested in sports and I know nothing and I don't have anything to do with it. But then I point out, well, that means that sports has affected you. I myself never really was very good at gym or PE. I was always on the sidelines. I was never good at team sports. And so very early on, we're kind of separated by our ability to play. Being able-bodied and able to play. Also by gender. Sports are heavily, can be heavily based on boys and men, right? Women's and girls' teams don't get a lot of attention, and women and girls as athletes don't always get a lot of attention. And also non-binary people, they often are excluded from sports, right? So it's this exclusion that also makes us very connected to sports. Race, sports, especially in the US, are heavily racialized. What sports are for what race, who gets to play. And even if you look at headlines, there are all sorts of ways that people make racist remarks or racial remarks about players. The other part about it too, it is often taught in school because it teaches cooperation. It's about playing on the team. But in the same way, it also teaches competition. There's a lot of contradictions here. On one hand, you're meant to cooperate. On the other hand, you're meant to compete. This also depends on the sport you're in. So what Jung is saying is sports, gym, this kind of athletic activity is really where very early on, where you as an individual learns how to interact with other individuals on their team, but they also learn to interact with society. Teams play, if you think about school teams, your school team might play another school. You might start playing another city's school. You might play another state. You have interstate and international games, and then you have, or intranational games, and then you have international games. So the team goes from being your school or your local town, and it then goes into being your city, your state, or then it goes to being your country and representative of that nation. So it's how the individual learns their place in all these different configurations of society. That's a pretty cool thing to think about. And and he's saying it teaches us at the very basic level, again, physically, how we interact with society, with other people around us, and how society marks our ability to interact in this way. So then we're going to go focus on Song Ki-jung, who he writes a lot about in this article. And here we have a picture of Son. And so he, again, is the runner who won the gold in the marathon. And here's a photo of him. And if you notice this photo, he is wearing the Japanese flag. And as soon as he won the gold, he comes out and there's the Japanese flag on his uniform, and he has to sing the Japanese anthem. And what John points out is this is a really huge moment for Koreans, because although a Korean person had won, because Korea was colonized by Japan, he won not for Korea as a country or Chosun. He was winning for the Japanese and the Japanese government. And so he has this quote where Son, in an interview, said he was happy, but he couldn't stop crying. And so this was something that he really focuses on. So, and we have to remember from this article too, when he wins, Koreans first start shouting, "Long live Son, long live Son Ki-jung." And then they erupt into a chant that says, "Long live Chosun independence," or "Long live Korean independence." So he's saying we have these two really contradictory things going on, that Japan has won, but the Koreans are running out into the street and shouting, "Long live Chosun independence," a phrase that during the time was banned because it was anti-colonial government, right? It was for the Korean people. And here we have Son saying that he can't stop crying on the radio as they're kind of shouting these slogans, "Long live our independence." And so what John points out is this is really the colonial oppression, that Koreans had internalized the oppression of the colonial authorities. So to internalize something is to make it part of you, to make it part of your identity. And this oppression, part of this was that the idea that the Japanese would often put in all their education materials, all their political, their scientific research even, that Koreans were physically, mentally inferior to Japanese people, that they deserved to be colonized because they were inferior to the Japanese, and that the fact of being Korean and Japanese, they believed that Koreans were a different race, that being of this different race means that they were lesser than, and that even though maybe rationally Koreans knew this weren't true, they still internalized this feeling of inferiority, that they were somehow not as good as the Japanese, that they weren't as modern, that they weren't as good at sports and athletics. But now in this moment where Son wins, they're proven wrong, and they don't have to hide their feelings. And they're not kind of they're kind of letting these tears out and letting this joy out at the same time. And the tears because of this kind of confusion of feeling inferior and knowing that they're being oppressed, but also this joy of knowing, of kind of being able to prove that they were, at least in sports, in the athletic arena, as good as the Japanese, and at this moment, the best in the world. So after focusing on this, and then, John focuses a lot on the different radio broadcasts that were happening in this buildup of Song Ki-jong's win, he then goes into what is called Red Devil Syndrome. And this was in 2002. The Korean team, the Red Devils, are becoming a major contender in global soccer. And for the first time, South Korea becomes a soccer nation. Once again, like the 1936 Olympics, people were running into the streets and celebrating. At this year in 2002, every bar and restaurant, almost every bar and restaurant, no matter where you were, got a TV and got cable so that they could broadcast the matches, so that everybody could see them and know what was happening. So he looks at this and says, again, it's another kind of outpouring of sentiments of both nationalism, right? But of also national culture, pride in having been kind of colonized, but then overcome that. And so he's saying there's all these mixed emotions coming around with it. And he has this really great quote, which you can pause and read, where he basically points out, like many of us feel, that being a Korean soccer fan, you don't really have a choice. If you are Korean, you have to be a fan of the Korean soccer team because of this national pride. Whether you like it or not, whether the team is doing good or bad now, you now have to be a Korean soccer fan. And I think a lot of people who have sports fans in their family or who are sports fans knows this sentiment. You root for your team no matter what. And this often has a very kind of local sentiment. He's saying for the Korean national team, this has very much a nationalist but national culture sentiment, that you have to root for Korea because you have to believe that despite years of colonization and turmoil, that Koreans are good enough to compete in a global sporting event. And he says even people, socialists, or people who are anti-government will still root for the Korean soccer team despite their anti-nationalist sentiment. They will still root for the Korean soccer team because there's such a strong feeling of relationship to sports and the international sporting event because of their history of colonization. So he's saying when he's watching this soccer game in this match, and he's so angry about South Korea and the US tying again in the aftermath of the Yangju tank accident, he says he had this timid inferiority complex, one that he didn't even realize he still had. And he said deep down inside when this happened, this voice in his head says, the truth is we're third rate. Should we really be permitted to have such good fortune? Should we be permitted to win this game? And he realized, even though now in 2002, he still had, as a Korean man, this inferiority complex that went back through history, back to the 1936 Olympics, that Koreans were maybe just not as good. And even though his rational mind says, this isn't true, this is just a game, it's just about soccer, when he's watching this match between the US and South Korea, he's holding his breath because he thinks, well, we really aren't supposed to win, right? We haven't won in politics, we haven't won in history, why would we win in soccer? And so he's saying when people are watching this game, it's more than just wanting to watch the sport. And this is why you saw people who didn't know anything about soccer. My own mother got all this soccer gear. I don't think she even really knew what a goal was or what the game was like, but she was watching this with such excitement on the edge of her seat because there's this anxiety and excitement of, will we show the world today that we are better than what history has told us, right? So he's saying there's all this sentiment and the fervor that's very, so this red devil syndrome that seems to be nationalistic, jingoistic, there is kind of internal anxiety and kind of excitement that's happening at the same time for everybody who's putting on their red uniforms and going in the street and cheering for the South Korean team. And one thing to think about is that in 1936, when Koreans yelled, long live Chosun independence or long live Korea, that even in 2002 and today at matches, Koreans will still shout, "Long live Korea," the same slogan that they shouted during colonialism, during revolutions, during uprisings against authoritarian governments and against the Japanese government. So finally, this is a little, oh, and I actually misnumbered that there. Sorry, this is not number 5 slide. This is number 4, the part. Cheon does something else very interesting because he is a historian. And in order to write this, he has gone through historical archives. And he has a short section where he talks about what history misses. So when you're just focusing on the games of 1936, what else happened in the summer of 1936? There was flood damage in southern areas, and it left many workers and families in South Korea starving, or in Korea, but the southern area of Korea. The Japanese government was becoming increasingly militarized, and there was internal vies for power that were shifting. And he also mentions a high school teacher hurt his foot while hiking and bathing in the springs and the mountains. And these are all kind of pieces that were in the archives he was seeing and in the newspaper and then in the news clippings, local news. And he's doing this to point out that, you know, as historians, or when we look at one major mass culture event or popular culture event, it's easy to focus on that as the only thing that's happening. But there are many other things during this time period that are happening, big and small, that are not exactly this huge event, but they are interconnected somehow in history. And I thought this is just a beautiful little snippet where he said, you know, the job of the historian is often very difficult because we have to determine what fits into a certain narrative. And he wants to say, well, this is what I didn't fit in, but it's still very important. Even the high school teacher who hurt his foot while hiking. So this is a wrap up for today's lecture. And if you have any questions about it, or especially if you're considering looking at sports and sporting events for your encyclopedia entry, if your artifact is about sports, I suggest rereading this in a lot of detail and go ahead and ask me some questions. What I did leave out to make this not so long is I also wrote about the most current Olympics, and we can talk a little bit about the South Korea, North Korea joint participation in the Olympics if you'd like. Thank you.